In 1902 in Chicago, USA, Elias Morton stood on the platform of the Clark Street elevated station, reciting in broken English a Latin phrase none present could translate, while holding a pocket watch that ticked in reverse. His clothing appeared meticulously handmade, yet decades out of date, and his left hand bore a tattoo that matched no military or fraternal registry. Witnesses noted his polite manners, stiff gait and formal way of speaking, which some likened to a Civil War-era preacher or a European diplomat. He introduced himself to city clerks as Elias Morton of Province 7, Southern Confederation, claiming he had arrived in error and urgently needed to return. His presence was first documented in a city report on indigents dated October 17, 1902, and quickly escalated to official concern after a customs ledger showed Morton had signed for a shipment of ink and copper wire under a non-existent company. That same week, 2 patients at the Dunning Asylum described seeing a man matching Morton's description inside a locked wing. Why did Chicago officials seal his name from all records after 1907? Elias Morton was initially seen as a curious but harmless eccentric, offering handwritten diagrams to local engineers and speaking of invisible relays with a dry, mechanical voice. A police memo from November 1902 noted his sudden absence from the city jail, despite a signed intake log and 3 guards sworn under oath that he had never left his cell. The first known address linked to Elias Morton was a rented rear room above Wrigley's print shop at 1428 South Halsted Street, documented in the 1902 Landlord Ledger as "Quiet man, foreign speech, no visitors." The shopkeeper, Roy Wrigley, a meticulous man with a thick mustache and the smell of ink always clinging to his sleeves, noted in his business diary that the new tenant paid 3 weeks in advance in silver coin, most dated prior to 1880, all impeccably clean. "Wears gloves even indoors," he added, and speaks in a clipped cadence like reading aloud from memory. The room was barely 12 feet wide, accessible by a narrow wooden stairwell that groaned with each step, the plaster walls scarred by soot and old advertisements. On cold mornings, Wrigley claimed, Morton was already awake before dawn, the thin light catching a strange sheen off his spectacles, which had a green tint that darkened under the lamp. There was no sound of sleep from the room above, only a rhythmic tapping as if he were measuring distances with metal tools against the floorboards. On October 21, 1902, local police received a complaint from a neighbor, Miss Clara Bellamy, a widowed seamstress living next door, who reported the smell of burnt vinegar and some kind of oil, sharp and chemical, seeping through the east wall. Her statement, preserved in Precinct Logbook Nushunt 12, described it as causing her eyes to water and her canary to fall from its perch. Bellamy knocked on Morton's door twice that day without reply. She testified that on the second attempt, there was a high buzzing inside like the hum of bees in a jar. 3 days later, Clara reported a conversation she overheard through the wall. According to her sworn deposition, the voice was unmistakably Morton's but shifted in tone mid-sentence, becoming quicker, less formal, using words I did not understand, gibberish, almost code. What disturbed her most was that the conversation had no response. It was one voice only, changing pitch, tempo, and vocabulary, pausing as if awaiting answers, then continuing again. The station captain dismissed her report as vivid nerves, yet it remained in the file marked pending. By November, the print shop's delivery boy, 11-year-old Walter Minsky, noticed that Morton stopped receiving food or parcels. The boy, paid to run errands for tenants, told his older brother that Morton refused contact, but once dropped a note through the floorboards with 2 coins and a list written in looping copperplate script, requesting quinine, ink, and wax of strong bond. Walter said the list smelled faintly of iron and had a corner burnt off. The boy's mother, suspicious, refused to fulfill the request, but the coins were never returned. On November 9th, a fire inspector named Harold Downey entered the building after a complaint of smoke from the chimney with no registered fire inside. Downey later wrote in his report, recovered from the municipal archives in 1911, that Morton's room was in violation of code for chemical storage, though no legal action was pursued. The inspector described a folding table covered in jars of blue-black liquid, gears arranged in spirals, and a chart pinned to the wall showing what appeared to be railroad tracks overlaid with hand-drawn notations in Latin and ciphered English. When questioned, Morton simply said, "These are corrections for prior events." Downey also noted a peculiar device on the desk, a box with copper terminals, wound with dyed string, attached to a hollow metal rod that emitted a soft vibration when touched. Morton claimed it was a harmonizer for local discrepancies, but declined to elaborate. The inspector left without issuing a citation, but recorded feeling a throbbing beneath the floorboards, like a second heartbeat. No follow-up was made. 2 weeks later, on November 22nd, Wrigley's apprentice Amos Field fell ill after entering Morton's room by mistake while attempting to inspect the gas line. Field's fever lasted 3 days, during which he reported seeing blue symbols floating above his hands. Though dismissed as delirium, his employer found his clothing stiff with some crystalline residue. Field was dismissed from the shop shortly after, and no further mention of him appears in local employment records. Then came the matter of the Dunning Asylum patients. On December 3, 1902, 2 residents, Arthur Beale, a cobbler institutionalized for hysteria, and James Henry Yates, a former court clerk with signs of paranoia, independently reported that a man with a green lens over one eye had entered their walls and floors with a narrow moving rod, like he was studying muttering furniture. Corrections aloud. Yates described the man as silent, dressed in a long coat of dark wool with the smell of sulfur and paper glue. Neither man had any access to communication, yet their accounts matched in content and language. Staff conducted a review and found no breach of security. The locked wing, according to institutional records, had been sealed from the outside that night. Yet one nurse, Ellen McCrae, told a colleague that her key had vanished for a full day before reappearing in her coat pocket. She was not formally interviewed. The first public notice appeared in the Chicago Herald on January 4, 1903, buried beneath shipping schedules. The piece, titled "A Curious Tenant," described a peculiar fellow named Morton, who was seen attempting to enter the Illinois Central Rail Yard with a rolled canvas tube and what appeared to be a sextant. When confronted by guards, he stated plainly that he was measuring offset from 1879's transit path. He was not arrested, only escorted out. The reporter noted his speech as so dry it sounded memorized, like he was reading from a book without punctuation. Over the following weeks, Morton's behavior became less predictable. Wrigley claimed he once saw Morton staring out the window at a pile of snow as if unsure what it was. The heat in his room remained unused, despite the frost that caked the inside of the glass. At times, Wrigley would hear sudden bursts of sound, not screams, not music, but like a phonograph failing to engage properly. Morton once handed him a note that read only, "Location unreliable after 12th. Notify if salt spoils." By mid-February, 3 letters addressed to Morton were returned to sender. The return names were untraceable, and all bore postmarks with partially erased dates, appearing to read January 13, 1892, although sent from within the city. These were later retrieved by a postal clerk named Merrill Gunn, who began compiling a quiet dossier. Gunn, suspicious of how Morton bypassed certain mail restrictions, began copying portions of the letters, noting oddities such as reference to adjustments and phase realignments. None of these terms matched any telegraph or engineering codes in use at the time. The final straw came in March 1903, when Elias Morton arrived at the Union Stockyards office with a printed permit bearing the signature of a supervisor who had been dead since 1898. He requested temporary clearance to survey existing junctions prior to collapse. The clerk on duty, Edwin Locke, was baffled by Morton's tone, not urgent, but expectant, as though this were a routine filing. Locke stalled, citing verification needs. Morton simply said, "Then you will miss your window." That night, the station logs recorded a break-in at the Northern Rail shed. Nothing was stolen, but the doors had been opened from within, and a residue of scorched wax was found on the latch. The same substance later matched to the residue from the jars in Morton's room. When police arrived to question him the next day, Morton was gone. The disappearance of Elias Morton from the room above Wrigley's print shop on March 19, 1903, did not result in immediate alarm. Roy Wrigley, burdened with delayed press orders and facing a machinery breakdown, only noticed the absence after 3 days. The rent had already been paid through April, and the door remained locked from the inside. Wrigley hesitated to force entry until a foul odor began to seep into the stairwell. Not rot, but something chemical and stale, like corroded batteries and damp wool. On March 23rd, Wrigley requested assistance from beat officer Joseph Hurst, who accompanied him up the narrow staircase. The key turned stiffly in the lock. When the door opened, both men were struck by a sudden stillness, as if the air inside had not moved in weeks. Dust particles swirled in the shafts of light cutting through the shutters. The window was half open despite the chill, and the smell was stronger near the floor where a pair of boots sat perfectly parallel beneath the table. The room was not empty. The table held 4 glass tubes arranged vertically, each half filled with dark liquid, sealed in wax at both ends. Copper wires ran between them in loops, but none appeared connected to any power source. A black cloth covered the central object, a tall cylinder with a small lens embedded on one side facing the far wall. When the cloth was removed, Officer Hurst later testified, the lens briefly flickered with a pale orange glow, then faded. He recorded the event in his report, but crossed out the line and scribbled malfunctioning gaslight beside it. On the bed lay several notebooks, all hand-stitched with red thread. The pages were filled with diagrams and notations in a script that alternated between clean English cursive and jagged angular symbols that resembled nothing in known alphabets. One passage, translated later by a cryptographer hired by the city's Department of Records, read, "Transit not linear. Anchor only where memory holds. Do not replicate near iron structures." The rest of the journal disintegrated shortly after cataloguing due to exposure to moisture. Only 2 pages survived. Officer Hurst sealed the room and filed a report classifying the scene as suspicious electrical activity, though no charges were brought. Within a week the space was cleared, and the rent ledger struck Morton's name with a single black ink line. But that was not the end. On April 1st, a railway engineer named Emery Thales submitted a letter to the Chicago Department of Survey and Engineering. He claimed that a man had approached him at the rail yard 2 weeks earlier with a precise correction to a switch junction that Thales had just personally recalibrated. The man gave his name as Morton and presented a folded card bearing an embossed seal of the Office of Railway Adjustments, an office that had been dissolved in 1895. Thales described the correction as uncannily accurate, adjusting the angle by mere centimeters to prevent long-term misalignment. At first he was grateful, but when he returned to the site later that week, the track had shifted again back to its original, flawed configuration, with no sign of disturbance. That night, he found the same folded card left under his pillow. He lived alone. Later that month, in the basement archives of the First Municipal Library on Adams Street, junior archivist Marla Quinn was indexing census forms from 1870 when she found a sheet labeled Temporal Integration Census, Trial Alpha, Region 3. The paper was filed among old water tax documents and bore the name Elias Morton under the heading Origin Designate Reverse Colony 12. The rest of the form was blank. She presented it to her supervisor, who dismissed it as a prank. When she returned to the file room later that afternoon, the document was gone. Quinn left the library job 2 months later, citing persistent interference with materials of record. Meanwhile, a private investigator named Bernard Thurlow, hired by the Wrigley family after rumors about the strange tenant began affecting business, tracked a series of financial anomalies tied to Morton's name. Between December 1902 and March 1903, 3 deposits were made to a savings account opened under Morton's name at the Pullman Trust Bank. Each deposit was exactly $33, always in silver certificates dated between 1881 and 1885. No witness ever saw Morton enter the bank. The signature on the account opening document, however, matched perfectly, not only Morton's known handwriting, but the signature style used in city employment contracts prior to 1888. Thurlow cross-referenced the signature with archived employment records from the late 1800s and found a near match in a ledger from the Illinois Surveyor's Office in 1879. The problem was, the listed Elias Morton in that ledger had died in 1882, in a boiler explosion in Springfield. The death certificate existed. So did the obituary. But the photo attached to his surveyor credentials, poorly preserved and faded, showed a man with the same tight-lipped expression, the same neatly combed dark hair, and the same round glasses with a green tint. The question of identity could no longer be ignored. Thurlow submitted his findings to the city clerk's office. No response came. 1 week later, his office was broken into. Only his locked file drawer was disturbed. All documents pertaining to Morton were missing. The thief, however, had made a mistake. They left behind the wax seal Thurlow had used to mark his case files. The seal had been melted, partially fused into the floor as if subjected to extreme localized heat. On May 5, 1903, the Chicago Medical Examiner's Office received an anonymous package. Inside were 6 folded pages, 1 damaged notebook, and a small wooden device resembling a tuning fork set into a polished base. The accompanying note read, "To be reviewed in context of current disruptions. Do not expose to field emission." The item was shelved under unidentified instruments and logged under Morton's name. When examined by a technician 2 weeks later, the device emitted a low-frequency hum for 12 seconds, then cracked along the base. The sound was never reproduced again, and the item has since disappeared from public record. During a routine census cross-check that summer, a city clerk noticed that Morton's name had appeared in 6 separate enumeration districts, often within days of each other. Each form listed him as a tenant or lodger, each in different handwriting, but always with the same occupation: corrections technician. The title did not exist in any official registry. In one instance, the census taker appended a note in the margin: "Unusual manner, interview brief, spoke as if rehearsed. No heat or food in the home." The convergence of anomalies prompted a closed-door meeting at the Office of Municipal Security in August 1903. The minutes from that meeting are sparse, but one surviving memo references individual EM Category 2 disruptor and recommends immediate expungement of all housing, employment, and financial traces. The phrase informal quarantining of legacy entries was underlined twice. By early September, Morton's known locations had been vacated or reassigned. His name no longer appeared in city directories or voting rolls. Clara Bellamy, the seamstress who had first reported the odor and strange conversation, found her own address reassigned to a new tenant with no explanation. Her appeal to the clerk's office went unanswered. Weeks later, her small workshop was cited for zoning violations and shuttered. The Wrigley print shop suffered a sudden drop in business. By the end of 1903, Roy Wrigley had sold the property and relocated to Joliet. His final ledger entry regarding Morton was a single line scratched hastily in the margin of a blank page. If he was from another century, he took something of ours with him. On October 8, 1903, a letter postmarked from Joliet arrived at the Chicago office of the Reform Bulletin, a small investigative newspaper known for its civic exposés and support for anti-corruption initiatives. The letter bore no signature, only the initials R.W. and a short message typed on plain stock paper. The man Elias Morton was not who he said he was, not a criminal, something worse. Print shop records tampered, objects remain. Someone should come. It was addressed to Elijah P. Greaves, senior correspondent and former seminary student turned investigative journalist. Greaves, aged 53, was known for his stern demeanor and exhaustive notebooks filled with minute handwriting and pins of thread, connecting names and dates like a tailor tracing a cursed garment. Within days, Greaves made the journey to the site on South Halsted Street. He found the print shop boarded up, its windows painted over from the inside. Local neighbors said the owner had left in the spring, but nobody recalled seeing movers, and no one had taken the lease since. Greaves noted the dust on the door handle was undisturbed, but the inner lock had been rekeyed. He paid a locksmith discreetly and entered the building on the morning of October 17th. The air inside was flat and cold. The walls still bore faint outlines of shelves, as though ghost furniture had only recently been removed. But in the far corner of the back room, not Morton's former quarters but the press room, Greaves found a single artifact left behind. A cloth-wrapped object tucked into a bricked-up hearth cavity. A thick glass plate like a lantern slide, etched with concentric circles and strange characters visible only when held at an angle. It felt unnaturally heavy for its size. Greaves pocketed it and left. Back in his office, he began compiling interviews and submitting records requests to the Department of Housing, the Chicago Health Board, and the Illinois Historical Survey. Over the next 4 weeks, he received contradictory responses. 3 agencies denied any record of an Elias Morton at the address, while a 4th provided a rental ledger, with his name partially scratched out and overwritten with Ellis Martin. When Greaves requested a copy of Morton's alleged deposit record at Pullman Trust Bank, he was informed that no such account existed, yet he obtained, through a contact inside the bank, a microfilm ledger from March 1903 showing 3 identical deposits. Each was marked Manual Override, no teller ID. When Greaves attempted to publish a short notice in the Reform Bulletin outlining these discrepancies, his editor declined, citing a letter from the city's Office of Public Order suggesting ongoing investigation and requesting media silence. Greaves, sensing obfuscation, took a train to Springfield to consult his acquaintance Henry Wexler, a legislative records clerk with access to internal memoranda and committee reports. Wexler retrieved a confidential file stamped Internal Review Only, dated June 1903, titled Subject Morton Contextual Drift and Risk of Overlap. The document referred to the individual not as a suspect, but as a foreign agent of unverified jurisdiction. It included a statement from a city planning inspector who claimed that Morton had submitted documents referencing a version of the 1893 Columbian Exposition that had never occurred, with entire sections relocated to Jackson Park and featuring exhibits that, to the inspector's knowledge, had not what appeared to be genuine authorization, bearing embossed seals and dates, impossible to authenticate. Wexler was ordered to return the file within 1 hour. When Greaves attempted to revisit the file 2 days later, it had been pulled from the archive entirely. The tension rose when Dr. Charles Lambert, a physics lecturer at Chicago's Armour Institute, published a discreet internal report noting the appearance of an unknown harmonics device sent anonymously to the engineering department. The device, bearing no maker's mark, was delivered with a handwritten note stating, "For calibration against temporal noise." Lambert's assistant activated the device using a small induction coil and reported a low-frequency oscillation followed by the dislocation of 2 nearby compass needles. The experiment was never repeated. The device vanished from the lab's secure cabinet the following week. Meanwhile, Greaves interviewed 2 former city employees willing to speak off the record: Merrill Gunn, the postal clerk who had copied Morton's mail, and Clara Bellamy, now living with a distant cousin in Evanston. Gunn said plainly, "Some of those letters, they looked old, but the postmarks were new, and the contents referenced events that hadn't happened yet. It was as if someone had mixed up the future and past into one document. He burned his copies," he claimed, "because someone started asking about them who shouldn't have known they existed." Bellamy's account had shifted. She no longer insisted on the humming or the voices, but focused instead on a single object Morton carried one morning in early 1903. It resembled a cane, but had a notched wheel at the top, and what she believed was a hinge mechanism. "He tapped it against the floor before walking," she said, "but when I watched closely, the tip didn't touch the ground. It hovered just above, and the shadow didn't match." Greaves documented her statement, but she refused further interviews. Then came the archival reversal. In December 1903, Greaves returned to the Municipal Archive building, attempting to retrieve property maps from 1902 to cross-reference Morton's residence. He found that the maps for South Halstead between 1400 and 1500 had been replaced. The new chart showed no building at 1428 in that year, only a narrow vacant lot. The previous maps he had viewed weeks earlier, hand-colored, water-damaged, and dated in faded ink, were missing. When he asked the archivist, a young man named Frank Loudon, about the discrepancy, Loudon paused before admitting, "We were told to discard outdated surveys, but they didn't seem outdated to me." Loudon was dismissed from his position 10 days later. At the same time, religious voices began to weigh in. Reverend Douglas Arnett of Trinity Reformed Church, a conservative theologian with ties to city officials, gave a sermon warning of false prophets in the language of machines, and those who walk among us speaking in codes not meant for men. Though not naming Morton directly, the timing was unmistakable. Several parishioners recalled an earlier visit by a strange man to Arnett's study, one who asked to see baptism records for the year 1874 and offered to correct the entries for accuracy. Arnett had refused. That record book later disappeared from the vestry. As 1903 ended, Greaves compiled his findings into what he titled the Morton Packet, 61 pages of transcribed interviews, annotated records, and cross-referenced inconsistencies. He shared a summary with the city's Bureau of Civic Integrity. Within a month, Greaves's office was shuttered for health code violations. He relocated to a boarding house in Hyde Park and carried the Morton Packet on his person at all times. In February 1904, Greaves sent a sealed copy of the packet to Senator Josiah K. Lorne, a known advocate for administrative transparency. The senator replied with a brief telegram, "Received, will review, unusual claims, advise caution." 2 weeks later, Lorne's office announced his sudden retirement due to declining mental clarity. His staff denied receiving any documents from Greaves. By now, conflicting accounts had become impossible to reconcile. Morton had been seen at a rail yard in January 1904 by a freight supervisor, who described him marking the ground with a device like a surveyor's wheel. But the date of that sighting overlapped with a signed receipt for a parcel he accepted at a post office 10 miles away. Both locations had time-stamped logs, both used different signatures, yet both were undeniably his. The final known photograph of Elias Morton emerged from a glass plate, negative developed at the North Side Department of Public Works. The image was found misfiled under drainage study and showed a man standing beside a measuring rod near the Lake Michigan shoreline. His face was blurred by motion or distortion, but his posture and attire matched Morton's known description. Behind him, half buried in the sand, was a tripod-like frame with wires extended outward like the ribs of an unfinished tent. The reverse side of the negative bore a faint inscription scratched by a thumbnail. "Correction begins here." On March 3, 1904, a former military cartographer named Norman Wilkes submitted an unsolicited report to the Chicago Department of Survey, referencing anomalous irregularities in time-bound coordinate overlays that began appearing in the city's official maps. Wilkes had been hired on temporary contract to digitize by hand several decades of street plan updates for a project involving new sewage grids. He noticed that streets documented in the 1884-1892 atlases began to reappear, unrequested in the newer charts, even though they had been officially removed from public record following the Great Fire's reconstruction push. The overlays, according to his diagram, were neither fully present nor fully erased. Ghosted roads intersected modern ones at mathematically inconsistent angles, rendering measurements invalid. In his notes, Wilkes cited one building number repeatedly, 1428 South Halsted. When his superiors dismissed the issue as clerical redundancy, Wilkes traveled to the address himself. He brought with him a printed section of the 1889 Ordnance Map and attempted to match it to the current topography. What he found was worse than contradiction. It was displacement. The sidewalk dimensions were off by exactly 6 inches from the curb inward, running along the property where Wrigley's shop had once stood. Brick measurements recorded during the 1895 tax audit were no longer reconcilable with the stone foundation visible in the alley. In the margin of his final report, Wilkes wrote, "Either this building moved or the block around it did. Either way, it does not match what the city believes it is." A week later, Wilkes was dismissed without notice. His apartment was vacated. The report disappeared from the survey office file index. Meanwhile, Elijah Greaves continued his quiet investigation from Hyde Park. With no office and only a small Remington typewriter salvaged from his former newsroom, he began assembling parallel timelines using public directories, baptism logs, and cemetery registries. What emerged was a pattern. Morton's name appeared at 10-year intervals but never linearly. It was always peripheral, as a witness signature, a rental cosigner, a shipping manifest notary, and always attached to transactions involving materials now classified or lost. In one 1897 entry, Morton was listed as a consultant on a boiler safety commission, though the commission's founding date was 1899. Greaves compiled 27 such anomalies before receiving a brief and unexpected visit. The man introduced himself as Mr. Ward, claiming to represent the Bureau of Civil Operations, a branch Greaves had never encountered. Ward was pale, soft-voiced, and refused tea. He asked only 3 questions: whether Greaves had spoken to anyone outside the city, whether he retained any original objects from the Morton inquiry, and whether he believed Elias Morton posed a danger. Greaves answered cautiously. Ward then asked to see the Morton packet. Greaves declined. Ward left a calling card with no title, only a seal embossed with the image of a compass rose overlaid with a key. The next morning, the boarding house's front desk received an anonymous complaint about Greaves's room. The owner, citing liability, asked him to vacate within 48 hours. That same evening, Greaves found the door to his room ajar. Nothing had been stolen, but the Morton packet had been moved. Not removed, not rifled through, but repositioned, as if to remind him that it was known. He secured it inside a wooden box with a sliding bolt and began drafting a coded version of his notes. Every new entry was copied in mirror writing, salted with deliberate falsehoods to detect tampering. When he returned one afternoon to find one of those falsehoods corrected, he stopped writing altogether and moved his files into a locked chest at the Hyde Park Public Storage Facility. Elsewhere, institutional reactions became more aggressive. At the Dunning Asylum, Nurse Ellen McCrae filed a second incident report nearly a year after her first, this time concerning the sudden silence of 3 patients who had previously spoken of Morton's midnight visit in 1902. All 3 men had been relocated to a different wing without paperwork. McCrae noted they no longer responded to their names, only to precise strings of numbers called aloud in sequence. Like some sort of signal, she wrote in her record. They flinch if the number is wrong. Her report was suppressed by the asylum's chief physician, but a copy was preserved by an orderly who leaked it to Greaves under the condition of anonymity. The page was stamped twice in red ink, internal review only and do not disseminate, CID lock. The meaning of the second stamp was never clarified. In early April, the Reverend Douglas Arnett gave a private interview to Greaves under the condition that nothing be published in his lifetime. Arnett, more gaunt now and frequently looking over his shoulder, admitted that in late 1902, a man identifying himself as Morton had entered his office and requested a full reading of every baptism performed in 1874. When Arnett refused, the man left behind a folded paper without explanation. It remained sealed for months, tucked between pages of the church ledger. When Arnett finally opened it, he found a list of 13 names, some baptisms, some unrecorded, with corresponding dates and single-word notations like delayed, aligned, or unverified. Several notations did not refer to the baptisms at all, but rather to civic functions. A rail inspection in 1881, a bridge collapse in 1893, a hospital expansion in 1901. Arnett could not explain how the names and events were connected, but weeks later, 3 families from his parish moved away without notice, their homes emptied and their addresses scrubbed from church rolls. Greaves pressed Arnett for the list. The Reverend refused and placed it in a locked drawer. Days after the interview, his study was ransacked. Only that drawer had been forced open. By mid-1904, a kind of institutional amnesia began to settle over Chicago. Clerks who had once confirmed Morton's name now claimed unfamiliarity. The Dunning Asylum Board reclassified all prior testimonies regarding him as delusional convergence and publicly denounced any further inquiry. At Pullman Trust Bank, the account Greaves had documented was erased from microfilm, the frames labeled emulsion failure. In a rare letter to his former editor, Greaves wrote, "The city is sealing its memory like a wound that cannot afford to scar." Then the final known sighting occurred. On June 11, 1904, at 3:17 a.m., a watchman named Joseph Halley at the abandoned rail terminal near 47th Street recorded a man walking along the elevated track alone, illuminated by the pale yellow of the station's oil lamp. Halley described the man as wearing a long coat, his right hand clasped behind his back, walking with measured steps. When Halley called out, the figure turned slightly but said nothing. He reached the central platform, then knelt and placed something metallic on the wooden planks. The object emitted a flash, not bright, but sharply defined, like a lens catching sunlight. The light formed a perfect circle on the far wall of the station house, held for 2 full seconds, then vanished. When Halley approached minutes later, no man was present. But embedded into the platform boards was a ring of scorched wood, and at the center a single polished brass token stamped with 3 characters, EM9. The watchman submitted the token to the precinct. No official report was filed. The item was never seen again. Greaves marked the date in red ink on the inner cover of his packet. That week he finalized his decision to disappear. Not out of fear, as he claimed in his final note, but because the record itself could no longer remain in the city. On August 7, 1904, a summer storm swept across Chicago with unnatural precision. At precisely 4:10 p.m., lightning struck a derelict rail post just behind the boarded remnants of the South Halsted Industrial Corridor. The bolt ignited no fire, yet it caused a transformer 2 blocks away to fail and sent a power surge through a long-abandoned switching junction. The resulting flicker cut the electric streetcar lines momentarily, causing a stack of filings to fall inside the surveyor's auxiliary depot at 54th and Wabash. Among the scattered folders, a storage clerk named Theodore Meeks found a parcel wrapped in oilcloth, wedged between 2 beams inside the cabinet's base. The initials EM were scratched faintly into the leather flap. Meeks, a man not known for curiosity, initially reported it as misplaced mail, but the contents prompted a re-evaluation. Inside were 4 thin notebooks, brittle and stained, filled edge to edge with meticulous entries. Their structure was familiar to any trained archivist: date, location, observation, but the dates spanned outside known record-keeping, extending into gaps: April 10, 1882, March 17, 1890, August 9, 1904, entries labeled correction logged, drift point surveyed, or junction negated. More troubling were the accompanying diagrams. They showed cross-sections of Chicago blocks with overlapping frames, certain alleyways and stairwells drawn twice from slightly different perspectives, as if observed on separate days by different eyes, but copied by the same hand. The parcel was quietly transferred to the Department of Civic Engineering for review. On August 10th, the department's technical consultant, Dr. Edmund Kessler, an urban systems engineer with 20 years of cartographic work behind him, was granted limited access. He opened the final notebook and found a pressed slip of vellum, stamped with the same seal that had once appeared on the forged Morton transit permit. A compass rose intersected by a key. The handwriting read, "If found outside of corridor, seal and notify Clerk 3A. Do not interpret alignment without field interface." The warning was disregarded. Kessler began a line-by-line breakdown of Morton's entries. One line in particular stood out, dated simply, August 12th, interior opening. The location listed was not South Halsted, but an address 4 blocks away, 812 Dawson Street, the former Municipal Records Annex, condemned since 1899 due to foundational rot. No repair requests had ever been filed, yet city utility ledgers showed consistent power surges near that address for at least 5 years, none of them traceable to an active grid line. 2 days later, at 5:45 a.m., on August 12th, a 4-man crew from the Department of Inspection arrived at 812 Dawson. They were instructed to survey the foundation integrity for pending demolition, but only Kessler was aware of the true motive. The others, Barnes, Shue, Wilkins, and First Lieutenant Mercer, attached from public safety, were instructed to maintain operational silence. The door was locked from the inside. There were no external windows. Access was forced through the loading dock. The air inside was different. Warm, dense, and still, it pressed in on the lungs like a subterranean crawl space. Dust hung suspended in the sun shafts that breached cracks in the outer wall. Beneath the creaking beams and moisture-eaten timbers, the floor was laid with perfectly aligned copper strips embedded into the wood. The strips matched Morton's diagrams. The team moved cautiously. No evidence of recent habitation was found on the ground level, but behind a false wall in the records room, concealed by a shelving unit bolted into brick, they found a metal hatch built flush into the floor. There were no hinges, no handle. Only a half-moon indentation at the edge and a faint glimmer of polished brass. When Mercer touched the brass with the butt of his flashlight, the hatch trembled audibly. Not from impact, but as if responding. Kessler instructed Barnes to pry it open with a chisel. It took several minutes. Once loosened, the hatch gave way with a sighing exhale, like a pressure valve releasing air. Below was a spiral descent, stone steps marked with chalk in narrow arcs, numbering backwards from 10. Only Barnes and Wilkins descended. The rest remained above for radio contact. The descent took 6 minutes. At the base, the two men found themselves in a hexagonal chamber, lined with what appeared to be conductor wire embedded in the stone. At its center was a tall glass column filled with layers of dust. Inside the glass was a collapsed apparatus, broken rods, spools of fine coil, and what appeared to be a miniature chamber encased in brass, now shattered. The chamber's inner wall bore a single line, etched in mirror script. Transit failed. Anchor compromised. Barnes reached out to touch the casing. The moment his glove met the brass, the column vibrated. A thin, metallic hum rose from beneath their feet. The sound was not mechanical. It resembled the droning of an immense tuning fork, continuous and disorienting. Wilkins staggered and vomited. The lights on their helmets flickered. Above them, the team lost contact. When the men returned 7 minutes later, both were pale and trembling. Wilkins' boots left dark residue on the floor that smelled faintly of sulfur and burned parchment. Barnes would not speak for the remainder of the day. Mercer wrote in his log, "They returned changed. No wounds, no injury, but they look through you now, not at you." Kessler attempted to photograph the chamber the following day. Every plate emerged blank, despite verified exposure and fresh chemicals. He returned 3 times that week, each time finding the chamber altered, small objects rearranged, fresh dust disturbed, chalk marks erased and redrawn. On the 4th visit, he found a note pinned to the inner hatch. "Sequence corrected, do not return." The handwriting matched Morton's. Word of the discovery reached a higher office. On August 17th at 3 Nax a.m., the site was sealed under direct order of the Municipal Bureau of Continuity. No such bureau appeared in the public index, but the uniforms arrived bearing its insignia. The spiral chamber was dismantled under silence. All remaining materials were crated and loaded into unmarked wagons, bound for a location not disclosed to the inspection crew. Barnes resigned 2 days later. He left a single message for Kessler, written on the back of a field sketch. It wasn't a machine, it was a warning. He vanished shortly after. Wilkins was admitted to a private sanatorium in Michigan under voluntary hold. Records list him as mute and unresponsive. Greaves, now working under assumed name Edmund Blair, received an anonymous letter dated August 22nd. The return address had been burned away. Inside was a single photograph clearly altered, the interior of the spiral chamber, taken from an impossible angle, directly overhead. At the center stood a blurred human figure, possibly male, with one hand raised. The gesture appeared instructional. The figure wore no hat, but the face was partially obscured by green-tinted spectacles. At the bottom of the photo, written in red pencil, "He didn't come from another time. He came to correct this one." That night, Greaves moved again. The photograph sent to Greaves marked a new phase of silence across every level of official Chicago life. No newspaper printed follow-ups. No departments acknowledged any investigation. And yet beneath the surface more threads frayed. In late August 1904, an assistant records officer named Celeste Brogan was instructed to audit the Municipal Archives basement storage, specifically a series of crates delivered from the former Dawson Street Annex. Upon opening crate 07-142, she discovered an object not listed on the manifest, a copper panel roughly the size of a ledger book, engraved with concentric grids and several faintly glowing indentations. The crate had been labeled Transit Switch Components, decommissioned. But Brogan's initial report to her supervisor described the item as pulsing faintly, like a living thing breathing through metal. Within hours, her report was pulled from the internal log. Brogan returned the next day to examine the panel again. It was missing. When she inquired, she was told the crate never existed, but a janitor later approached her quietly, claiming he had moved the crate himself the day before. He described it as unusually heavy for its size and colder than any object he'd handled. "It hurt to touch it," he said. "Not pain, just like my skin didn't belong there." Celeste was transferred to another department the following week. Elsewhere, remnants of the Morton files continued to surface in unpredictable places. A retired electrician named Glenn Farrow came forward to Elijah Greaves with what he claimed was a copy of Morton's blueprint, not of a machine, but of a building. The drawing, etched into a slate panel and recovered from a sealed vault beneath the Grant Street Trolley Exchange, depicted a floor plan of intersecting spirals. No labels, no measurements. At the center, a chamber not unlike the one found under Dawson Street. But Farrow insisted the structure was not subterranean. "It's vertical," he said. "Like it's meant to stand above the city, not below it." When Greaves asked where he found the slate, Farrow hesitated. "It was already there when we laid the trolley lines," he said. "We thought it was trash. But it never corroded, never cracked." It waited. Greaves now carried a smaller packet of evidence on his person, selected notes, reproductions of diagrams, a list of altered addresses. He shared these selectively with a small group of colleagues, most of whom had already witnessed discrepancies firsthand. One such person was Constance Boyle, a university-trained librarian assigned to the city's educational distribution office. She had tracked 9 different editions of the Chicago General Almanac, printed between 1890 and 1905. All listed the same publication house, same editor, same binding. But in the 1903 and 1905 editions, several calendar entries were missing. Local commemorative dates mostly, such as completion of the North Branch Aqueduct and Switch Yard Expansion Ceremony, February 17, 1898. In place of the missing events were 2 blank days, August 12th and September 6th. Both pages bore faint watermark impressions, only visible under lamplight, identical to the concentric diagram found in Morton's notebooks. Boyle brought the almanacs to a city historian, who dismissed the errors as typographical. When she returned the following day, the books were gone from the shelf. Her access to the archive was revoked. She joined Greaves that night and began transcribing what she remembered by hand. The convergence of these fragments reached a climax on the morning of September 3rd, 1904. At 4:43 a.m., a series of muffled vibrations were felt across the Bronzeville rail corridor. Telegraph lines from 3 separate junctions crackled with static, and one operator, Leland Priss, later testified that the codes he received were not Morse. They resembled Morse but followed no known structure. "I translated one line," he said. "It spelled Morton, backwards." Within hours, residents in the surrounding district reported a sound like a distant engine, rising in frequency but never crescendoing. Doors and windows vibrated slightly. Pigeons abandoned rooftops. One tenant on Langley Avenue described an electric pressure in her teeth. At 5:12 a.m., the vibrations ceased. That same hour, a sanitation crew working under contract with the Department of Public Works uncovered a sealed vault beneath a cobblestone alley off 44th Street, an alley not listed on any current or historic maps. The ground beneath had partially collapsed due to drainage erosion, exposing a metallic hatch with no rust, inscribed with the seal, "Compass, Rose and Key." 2 workers descended into what they assumed was an old cistern. What they found was a narrow corridor, octagonal in shape, lined with embedded rods similar to those described by Kessler. The floor was covered in a fine black residue, like carbon powder. At the far end stood a single chair, bolted to the floor, facing a curved panel of switches and empty sockets. Behind the chair was a mirrored surface, cracked across its center. But no reflection was visible, only darkness. The light from the men's lanterns stopped inches from its surface. One of the men, Howard Nelms, placed his hand near it and described a sensation like wind moving in reverse. They reported the sight to their supervisor. By sunrise, the area was cordoned off by uniformed agents with unmarked brass pins. The sanitation report was withheld from publication, but Greaves was already nearby. Having tracked vibrations and mapped the irregularities across the district, he anticipated a final breach. From a second-floor window across the alley, He observed the containment team as they loaded equipment into the underground vault, taking readings and sealing off entrances. He attempted to photograph the site using a collapsible plate camera. Only one image developed, the mirrored surface faintly glowing with orange light, and reflected within it the silhouette of a man standing upright, holding a rod vertically. The posture was unmistakable, identical to the figure seen in the photograph mailed to him weeks earlier. Greaves's reaction was not shock, but resolve. That evening, he transcribed every remaining piece of the Morton packet onto a single scroll and placed it inside a waterproof tin canister. He left instructions with Boyle and 2 others. If he disappeared, they were to mail copies of the scroll to libraries in 3 other cities under alternate names. He then returned to the vault site. He never re-emerged. No record exists of Greaves's formal death. His belongings at the Hyde Park boarding house were removed the next morning by men who presented no identification. The landlady was paid 3 months' rent in cash in advance. His name vanished from the resident registry. The tin canister, however, was retrieved from its hiding place and mailed as instructed. 2 copies were intercepted. 1 was delivered. It arrived anonymously at the New York Society for the Preservation of Civic Record in November 1904, wrapped in oilcloth and accompanied by a note with only 1 sentence. He entered to confirm the distortion, not to fix it. To this day, the scroll remains sealed in an interior archive. The Society refuses public access, and on certain late summer mornings just before sunrise, the Bronzeville rail corridor hums. By October 1904, the case of Elias Morton had effectively vanished from public discourse. There were no arrests, no indictments, and no funerals. Yet behind the sealed doors of Chicago's administrative infrastructure, the case left fissures that would never fully close. The first casualty was the municipal archives. Following the sealed vault incident on 44th Street, a quiet directive issued from an unnamed committee recommended a reduction of historical redundancies and unauthorized duplications. Within 6 weeks, over 30,000 documents were purged from the archive's secondary storage. Property records, planning maps, surveyor field journals, and obscure permits dating from 1868 to 1902. Most of them bore no direct connection to Morton, but several pages that did, including inspection reports from Wrigley's shop, letters addressed to unidentified city clerks, and multiple transit forms stamped with the compass rose and key, were last confirmed in storage days before the purge and have never surfaced since. Celeste Brogan was terminated without pension on November 12th. She appealed the decision, but her petition was returned unopened with no listed contact at the Bureau of Personnel. Her name was later misprinted in the official employment register as Colleen Brogan. She never worked in government again. Simultaneously, a series of unexplained transfers began within the Department of Civic Engineering. Dr. Edmund Kessler, who had overseen the evaluation of Morton's notebooks, was reassigned to waterline assessments in western Illinois. In a final letter to a colleague, he wrote, "I was warned not to interpret, but I did. And now I see the city not as a whole, but as repetition." The Municipal Bureau of Continuity, which had first appeared at the 44th Street site, was never mentioned in any annual city report. Yet in 1905, a new insignia began appearing on infrastructure schematics and boundary files. A small emblem of a compass rose without a key, etched into the lower right-hand corners of official prints. The symbol was not indexed, nor attached to any specific office. When asked, clerks denied knowledge of its meaning. And yet it persisted across the city's physical documents for the next 8 years, always positioned exactly 2 inches from the edge. At the same time, a public sanitation project initiated in spring 1905 required the excavation of several disused vaults beneath the South Side Industrial Corridor. The team overseeing the work recorded at least 6 instances in which mapped infrastructure differed from physical findings. One particular chamber beneath the remnants of the Dawson Street Annex was listed on all schematics as sealed storage, 1898. But the door that once led into it no longer existed. The stone wall had no seam. No evidence of bricking, no structural patchwork, just smooth, unbroken limestone where a doorway once stood. The chamber behind it was never accessed again. Greaves, or Edmund Blair as he was last known, was officially declared missing in 1906, after more than a year without contact. Boyle, his last known associate, made a formal inquiry through the city's Bureau of Records. The reply stated that no person of that name had ever held residency in Cook County. She submitted a copy of his boarding house lease as evidence. 2 days later, her storage locker at the Chicago Public Library was emptied. When she arrived to question the removal, the clerk on duty showed her a destruction notice signed by her own name. She left the city shortly after. As years passed, the story of Elias Morton shifted from documented oddity to whispered invention. Newspapers that had once hinted at irregularities now published dismissive retrospectives. The Chicago Herald called it a tale of bureaucratic confusion inflated by fringe theorists. When questioned on the inconsistencies in the early municipal ledgers, editors attributed the errors to typesetting failures or damage during the warehouse flood of 1908, an event that notably was never officially recorded in city maintenance logs. Educational materials quietly omitted the Morton incident altogether. By 1910, no reference could be found in civic handbooks or instructional texts used in city-run schools. The Morton packet, preserved only in fragmentary copies by 2 remaining colleagues of Greaves, was passed along as a curiosity, its tone too measured to be fiction, but its content too methodical to be comfortably real. Still, the disturbances did not fully end. Beginning in the winter of 1907, telegraph operators in the lower industrial districts began filing intermittent complaints regarding interference. The signals, though brief, followed a recognizable sequence, a pattern of reversed pulses paired in primes. One technician likened the sound to a heartbeat echoing backwards through the line. Each report was dismissed as cable aging or mechanical resonance, but the pattern was consistent and always concentrated around former Morton-linked zones. In early 1908, city electricians repairing wiring beneath the 47th Street junction uncovered what appeared to be a narrow conduit embedded in the stone, not for water, gas, or signal. Inside, coiled copper strands and glass spheres filled with a soot-like substance lined a duct with no known terminus. The materials were catalogued but misplaced before analysis. The report was marked incomplete and archived with no follow-up. That spring, a contractor demolishing a condemned warehouse on the outskirts of the rail district discovered a room that was not part of any known floor plan. Dustless, dry, perfectly square. Its only content was a chair bolted to the center and a charred ring around its base. The foreman ordered it sealed before the inspectors arrived. His team received hazard compensation and was reassigned. The chair was never mentioned again. Though most citizens never heard Morton's name after 1904, those who had, those who once interacted with him, however briefly, reported strange shifts in memory over the following years. One described a recurring dream in which he walked into rooms that did not exist, but found objects there that were later real. Another, a former train conductor, claimed that his watch gained exactly 24 seconds on the same date every year, March 19th. He replaced it 3 times. The result never changed. By 1911, nearly every building tied to Morton's movements had either been demolished, repurposed, or reassigned in city registries. The site of the Wrigley print shop was paved over and converted into a municipal records annex, with no acknowledgement of its past occupant. The structure lasted less than 2 years before suffering unexplained structural buckling and being condemned. That same year, a janitor cleaning the basement archives of City Hall found a sealed envelope wedged between filing cabinets. It contained a single sheet of paper, crisp and unyellowed. No signature, no date, only 6 words centered in the middle, printed in black ink. This alignment was never fully corrected. In the years following 1912, Chicago entered a phase of rapid modernization. Elevated rail systems expanded, entire neighborhoods were redistricted, and much of the city's late 19th century infrastructure was buried under new steel and brick. The work was praised as progress, but those familiar with the Morton case recognized the pattern. Areas linked to his movements were not simply redeveloped. They were overwritten methodically, as though the city were attempting to reset itself from the inside out. The old Holstead corridor, once filled with press shops, boarding rooms and light industry, vanished from planning maps. New plats were drawn with fresh lot numbers, ignoring the layered tax records that still existed on brittle paper in shuttered basements. In public statements, no reference was made to the erasures. Land titles simply reappeared with new owners. The names of former tenants, including Wrigley, Bellamy and others, faded into legal silence. Yet the process was not without resistance. In 1910, a group of independent archivists working from a rented storefront on Milwaukee Avenue compiled a report titled The Suppressed Alignments of Chicago. It detailed inconsistencies in postal routes, overlapping construction permits, and duplicate survey marks on foundation beams of buildings more than a mile apart. One section was dedicated entirely to Elias Morton. They presented their findings to a local academic review board. The group was labeled speculative. Their storefront lease was revoked the following month. One of them, a records clerk named Isaac Trent, later relocated to Cleveland, where he quietly distributed mimeographed copies of the report to libraries under the pseudonym J. M. Alston. Most were discarded unread. A single surviving copy remains in the archival basement of a small university, mislabeled as a fictional pamphlet. As the city reshaped itself, so too did the language of its bureaucracy. In late 1911, Chicago's Department of Records and Assessment implemented a new classification system for urban infrastructure anomalies. Instead of flagging items as errors or irregularities, they were now assigned a neutral designation, non-conforming alignment. The new terminology allowed for unexplained dimensions, mismatched grid references, and contradictory dates to be processed without investigation. Dozens of files tied to the Morton footprint were quietly reclassified this way. Among them was a field report from a crew that dismantled an obsolete switching tower on the city's South Branch. The workers discovered beneath the tower's foundation a brass panel identical in dimension and marking to the one originally found at Dawson Street, copper-laced, with a circular depression at the center, and markings etched so shallowly they could only be seen when rubbed with graphite. The foreman, a veteran named Garrett Lowe, brought the panel to his supervisor. Within hours, the panel was removed by men identifying themselves only as contractors for historical preservation. The name of that division did not exist in any city index. When Lowe asked for a receipt, he was given a card bearing the seal of the Compass Rose. No address, no contact. Lowe retired 6 weeks later and left no forwarding address. In the winter of 1912, the last remaining piece of Elias Morton's known possessions was recovered by accident. A teacher at the Southside Technical Institute, examining outdated laboratory cabinets for disposal, found wedged behind a false drawer a tightly bound leather notebook. It was partially scorched and missing its cover. The pages that remained showed diagrams similar to those in the Morton packet, intersecting paths, non-Euclidean angles, and notations that referenced no known material. One sentence was repeated 5 times on the final page, each written in slightly different handwriting. Anchor displaced, alignment unpredictable. The notebook was never catalogued. The teacher, whose name has been omitted from public record, reportedly placed the object into a fireproof box and handed it over to a colleague in physics. That box was later found empty. By mid-1912, all references to Elias Morton had been removed from the city's active registries. His name no longer appeared in housing records, employment lists, or census ledgers. The only surviving official document bearing his signature, the permit signed at the Union Stockyards, was quietly removed from the city clerk's vault and replaced with a blank duplicate. The original signature was found 2 years later by a clerk training in document authentication. It had been cut from the page with surgical precision, leaving only the lower edge of the M. A rumor persisted among low-level municipal staff that a special unit within the Department of Boundaries and Transit Corrections was still investigating legacy discrepancies. No such department was ever listed, but one custodian reported that a light remained on in their unused sub-basement long after hours. Inside, he once glimpsed a chalk map drawn directly on the floor, a crude outline of the city, ringed with markings and faded annotations. In the center, A single point marked with the initials EM. He was transferred days later. In the decades that followed, the Morton case became a ghost, not in the spectral sense, but as a shape that moved just out of view. It was no longer cited, only whispered. Its evidence did not disappear. It was simply never acknowledged. And within this silence, a strange truth took root. Those who remembered were few, but those few remembered exactly. Constance Boyle, who had protected Greaves's documents, lived into her 70s. In her final interview, recorded for an unrelated study on urban history, she mentioned a name not in response to a question, but in passing. Morton was a mirror, she said, not of time, but of correction. The city saw itself wrongly, and he came to right the right shape. When asked to explain, she only shook her head and added, "Not everything is allowed to be remembered at once." After 1912, no further sightings, letters, or recovered objects were ever tied to Elias Morton. Yet in the municipal budget for 1913, a line item appeared under special contingency allocations: compensation, transit adjustments, Category B. The funding amount was modest, but the field beneath recipient designation was left blank. Every year until 1921, the line item was renewed, and always without exception, the payment was issued on March 19th. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.